On a frozen December morning in 1940, in the snow-covered forests of Belgium, a 19-year-old American soldier named Francis Currey stood alone in the ruins of a factory building and watched an entire German armored battalion roll toward his position. There were 5 German tanks closing in from 3 directions. There were hundreds of German infantry soldiers moving through the trees, using the tanks as cover. Behind Currey were 300 American soldiers pinned down by the German attack, with no way to retreat and no way to fight back, because the Germans had destroyed most of their weapons and killed most of their officers. The entire American position was about to be overrun, and everyone knew it. Francis Currey had 2 choices. He could stay in his defensive position and die with everyone else when the Germans broke through. Or he could grab whatever weapons he could carry and walk out into the open alone and try to stop an entire German battalion by himself. Francis Currey was not a career soldier. He was not a trained commando or a special forces operator. 6 months earlier, he had been a schoolteacher in upstate New York, teaching mathematics to children in a small rural classroom. He had never fired a gun before he joined the army. He had never been in a fistfight. He was quiet and polite, and his fellow soldiers back in training camp had thought he was too soft to survive combat. But on this freezing December morning, in the middle of the Battle of the Bulge, Francis Currey would do something that military historians still study today as one of the most extraordinary individual acts of courage in American military history. He would walk directly into the German attack carrying a bazooka and a rifle, and he would systematically destroy 5 German tanks and kill or wound dozens of German soldiers, and he would do it alone in the open with bullets and shells exploding all around him for 30 minutes straight until the German attack collapsed. This is the story of Francis Sherman Currey. This is the story of how a quiet schoolteacher became the most lethal soldier on the battlefield during one of the most desperate days of World War II. This is the story of how one ordinary American did the impossible when everything depended on it. This is the story of a Medal of Honor that was earned in 30 minutes of pure hell. This is the story of a hero who came home and went right back to teaching school like nothing had happened. This is the story they should have told you in history class. This is the story of the teacher who saved a battalion. The cold morning air hung still and heavy over the Belgian forest near the village of Normandy on December 21st, 1944. The snow was 6 inches deep and still falling. The temperature was 15 degrees and dropping. The men of the 3rd Battalion, 120th Infantry Regiment of the 30th Infantry Division, were dug into frozen foxholes along a ridgeline, watching the forest below them for any sign of German movement. They had been fighting continuously for 5 days since the Germans launched their massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest in what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. The men were exhausted. They were running low on ammunition. They had not slept in days. They had not eaten a hot meal in a week. Their winter uniforms were inadequate for the brutal cold, and many of them had frostbite on their feet and hands. They were holding a defensive position that was supposed to be temporary, but had turned into a desperate last stand because there was nowhere to retreat to, and no reinforcements coming to help them. Francis Currey was crouched in a shallow foxhole at the forward edge of the American position. He was 19 years old. He had been in combat for 4 months since landing in France after D-Day. He looked even younger than his age. He had a baby face and soft brown eyes, and when he smiled, he looked like he should be throwing a baseball in a backyard somewhere in America, instead of fighting Germans in the snow. He had joined the army in 1943, when he was 18 years old, because every young man his age was joining, and he felt it was his duty. He had wanted to be a pilot, but he had failed the vision test, so they made him an infantryman instead. He had gone through basic training at Fort Benning, Georgia, and learned how to shoot and march and take orders and survive. Then they shipped him to England, and then to France, and then to Belgium, and now here he was in a frozen hole in the ground waiting for the Germans to attack. The Germans came at dawn. They came with everything they had. 5 Panther tanks crashed through the tree line 800 yards below the American position with their engines roaring and their tracks churning up snow and mud. Behind the tanks came waves of German infantry in white winter camouflage, carrying rifles and machine guns, and moving in coordinated assault formations. The German artillery opened up, and shells began exploding along the American ridge. Machine gun fire raked the American foxholes. The Americans started shooting back, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. The German tanks kept coming. They were heading straight for the center of the American line, where a breakthrough would split the battalion in half and allow the Germans to roll up both flanks and destroy the entire position. Francis Currey watched the tanks coming closer. He could hear the screaming of wounded men all around him. He could hear American officers shouting orders that no one could follow because the German fire was too heavy. He could see soldiers trying to pull back from the forward positions and getting cut down by machine gun fire before they made it 10 yards. He realized in that moment that unless someone stopped those tanks, the entire battalion was going to die right here in this frozen forest, and the Germans were going to break through and maybe change the whole outcome of the Battle of the Bulge. He looked around and saw that everyone else was pinned down or wounded or dead. He realized that if anyone was going to stop those tanks, it was going to have to be him. So he climbed out of his foxhole and started walking toward the German attack. Francis Sherman Currey was born on June 29, 1925, in the small town of Loch Sheldrake in Sullivan County, New York. It was a quiet rural area in the Catskill Mountains region, about 90 miles northwest of New York City. The town had maybe 500 people, and most of them made their living from small farms or from the summer resort businesses that catered to tourists from the city who came up to the mountains to escape the heat. Francis grew up in a modest house on a quiet street with his parents and 2 younger sisters. His father worked as a caretaker for one of the resort hotels, and his mother stayed home to raise the children. They were not rich, but they were not poor either. They had enough to get by, and they believed in working hard and treating people right, and going to church on Sunday. Francis was a quiet child. He was polite and well-mannered and never caused trouble. He did well in school because he paid attention and did his homework and respected his teachers. He was not the biggest kid or the toughest kid or the most popular kid, but everyone liked him because he was kind and he helped people when they needed help. He played baseball in the summer with the other boys in town, and he was a decent player but not a star. He went fishing in the local streams, and he helped his father with work around the house, and he read books from the library. He had a normal small town American childhood in the 1930s when the whole country was struggling through the Great Depression, but communities like Loch Sheldrake held together because everyone looked out for each other. When Francis was in high school, he discovered that he was good at mathematics. Numbers made sense to him in a way they did not make sense to other students. He could solve complex problems in his head while other students were still writing out the equations. His teachers noticed his talent and encouraged him to think about going to college to study engineering or accounting. Francis liked the idea, but his family did not have money for college, so he started thinking about other options. He thought maybe he could teach school like some of his favorite teachers had done. He thought teaching would be a good, steady job, and he would be helping young people learn, and that seemed like a worthwhile way to spend a life. Francis graduated from high school in 1943 when he was 17 years old. The country had been at war since Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, and everyone Francis knew had someone in the service. His older cousins were in the Army and Navy. Boys just a few years older than Francis were coming home on leave in uniform with stories about training camps and ships heading overseas. The whole country was mobilized for war. Factories were running 3 shifts making tanks and planes and ships. Women were working in defense plants. Families were growing victory gardens and collecting scrap metal and buying war bonds. Everyone was doing their part. Francis knew that as soon as he turned 18, he would have to register for the draft, and he would probably be called up to serve. He thought about waiting to be drafted, but he decided instead to enlist. He wanted to have some choice in what branch he served in and what job he would do. He wanted to be useful. He wanted to serve his country like everyone else was doing. On his 18th birthday in June of 1943, Francis Currey walked down to the Army recruiting office in the nearby town of Liberty, New York, and signed the papers to enlist. The recruiter asked him what he wanted to do in the Army, and Francis said he wanted to be a pilot. The recruiter gave him an eye test, and Francis failed it. His vision was not bad enough to disqualify him from service, but it was bad enough to keep him out of pilot training. The recruiter told him he could be an infantryman instead. Francis did not know much about what infantrymen did, but he figured it was important work, and he said yes. He went home and told his parents he had enlisted. His mother cried. His father shook his hand and told him he was proud of him. His sisters hugged him and made him promise to write letters. A week later, Francis Currey got on a bus and rode down to New York City, and then got on a train that took him south to Fort Benning, Georgia, to begin basic training. He was 18 years old, and he had never been more than 50 miles from home in his entire life. Fort Benning, Georgia, in the summer of 1943 was a sprawling military base where tens of thousands of young American men were being transformed from civilians into soldiers as fast as the Army could process them. Francis Currey arrived at the base on a hot July morning and was immediately thrown into the organized chaos of infantry basic training. He was issued a uniform and boots and a duffel bag full of equipment. He was assigned to a barracks with 50 other recruits from all over the country. He was given a rifle and a helmet and a canteen and told to learn how to use all of it. Then the training started, and it did not stop for 13 weeks. The physical training was brutal. The recruits woke up before dawn every morning and ran for miles in full gear. They did push-ups and sit-ups and pull-ups until their muscles burned. They crawled through mud under barbed wire while instructors fired machine guns over their heads. They climbed obstacles and rappelled down walls and carried heavy packs on forced marches through the Georgia heat. Francis had never done anything this physically demanding in his life. He was in decent shape from playing baseball and working around the house, but this was a different level entirely. For the first 2 weeks he thought he might not make it. His feet were covered in blisters. His shoulders were raw from the pack straps. He was so tired at night that he fell asleep the moment his head hit the pillow, but he kept going. He pushed through the pain and the exhaustion because everyone else was doing the same thing, and he was not going to be the one who quit. The weapons training was intense. Francis learned how to field, strip and clean and reassemble his M1 Gar and rifle until he could do it blindfolded. He learned how to shoot from standing and kneeling and prone positions. He learned how to adjust for wind and distance. He learned how to throw grenades and set up machine guns and fire mortars. He learned how to use a bayonet and fight hand-to-hand. The instructors were tough veterans who had seen combat, and they did not tolerate weakness or mistakes. They yelled and cursed and pushed the recruits harder than they thought they could be pushed. Francis kept his head down and did what he was told. He was not the best shot in his training company, but he was good enough. He was not the fastest runner, but he finished every run. He was not the loudest or the toughest, but he earned the respect of the other men because he never complained and he never quit. The tactical training taught Francis how to survive on a battlefield. He learned how to read maps and use a compass. He learned how to dig a proper foxhole that would protect him from artillery. He learned how to move through terrain without being seen. He learned how to recognize the sound of different weapons' fire so he would know if it was American or German. He learned how to work as part of a squad where every man had a job and every man depended on the others to stay alive. He learned that war was not about individual heroics, but about ordinary men doing their jobs under impossible conditions and trusting each other to do the same. The training was designed to prepare him for the reality of combat, and the instructors told them over and over that everything they were learning could be the difference between living and dying when they got overseas. Francis Currey completed basic training in October of 1943. He was assigned to the 120th Infantry Regiment of the 30th Infantry Division, which was stationed at Fort Jackson, South Carolina. The division was preparing to deploy to Europe as part of the massive buildup of American forces for the invasion of France. Francis spent the next 6 months doing advanced infantry training and unit exercises. He learned the specific tactics and procedures of his regiment. He got to know the men in his squad and his platoon. He made friends with other soldiers who were also far from home for the first time. They wrote letters to their families and girlfriends. They went into town on weekend passes and went to the movies and ate at diners and tried to have some normal fun before they shipped out. They talked about what they thought combat would be like, but none of them really knew because none of them had ever experienced it. In April of 1944, the 30th Infantry Division boarded transport ships in New York Harbor and sailed across the Atlantic Ocean to England. Francis Currey stood on the deck of the transport ship as it pulled away from the dock and watched the New York skyline disappear behind him. He thought about his parents and his sisters back home in Loch Sheldrake. He thought about the small town life he was leaving behind. He thought about whether he would ever see home again. Then he went below deck to his bunk and tried to sleep while the ship rolled in the ocean swells. The crossing took 2 weeks. The men were packed into the ship like sardines, and most of them were seasick. They ate bad food and slept in cramped quarters, and waited for the journey to end. When they finally arrived in England and marched off the ship onto solid ground, Francis felt like a different person than the boy who had left Georgia 2 weeks earlier. He felt like he was part of something bigger than himself now. He felt like he was a soldier. The 30th Infantry Division spent 6 weeks in England training for the invasion of France. They practiced amphibious landings on English beaches. They studied aerial photographs of the Normandy coast. They memorized their objectives and rehearsed their movements until everyone knew exactly what they were supposed to do. The invasion had already happened on June 6, 1944, while they were still training, but the fighting in France was brutal, and the army needed every available division to reinforce the beachhead and break out into the French countryside. On June 26th, the 30th Division landed on Omaha Beach 20 days after D-Day. Francis Currey waded ashore through the surf carrying his rifle and his pack and stepped onto French soil for the first time. The beach was still littered with wrecked equipment from the initial invasion. There were burned-out tanks and destroyed landing craft and huge craters from artillery shells. Francis could see the bluffs above the beach where the Germans had fired down on the first waves of troops. He tried not to think about how many Americans had died on this beach 3 weeks earlier. He focused on moving inland with his unit to join the fight. The 30th Division entered combat in early July during the American breakout from the Normandy beachhead. Francis Currey experienced his first combat action on July 7th near the town of Saint-Jean-de-Day. His battalion was ordered to attack a German defensive position and clear the enemy from a series of hedgerows that crisscrossed the Norman countryside like a maze. Francis had trained for this, but nothing had prepared him for the reality. The noise was overwhelming. Artillery shells exploded, and machine guns hammered, and rifles cracked, and men screamed. The hedgerows were thick walls of earth and vegetation that the Germans had turned into fortified positions. Every hedgerow had to be assaulted individually, and the Germans would wait until the Americans were in the open, and then cut them down with machine gun fire. Francis learned very quickly that combat was nothing like the movies. It was not glorious or exciting. It was terrifying and confusing, and men died in stupid random ways that made no sense. He saw his first dead German soldier lying in a ditch with half his head blown off. He saw his first dead American lying in a field with his hands still gripping his rifle. He learned to keep moving and keep his head down and do his job because stopping to think about what was happening would paralyze him with fear. The 30th Division fought its way through France over the next 3 months. They fought at Saint-Lô and broke through the German lines during Operation Cobra. They fought at Mortain and helped stop a major German counterattack that could have cut off the American advance. They liberated French towns and villages, and were greeted by crowds of grateful civilians who threw flowers and offered wine and kissed the American soldiers. Francis saw the joy on the faces of people who had lived under German occupation for 4 years, and he understood for the first time what they were really fighting for. They were not just fighting to defeat Germany in some abstract strategic sense. They were fighting to free real people from tyranny and oppression and give them back their lives. It made the suffering and the fear and the death mean something. By September, the 30th Division had fought its way into Belgium. They crossed the border and pushed toward the German frontier. The Germans were retreating, but they were fighting hard defensive battles every step of the way. Francis Currey had been in combat for 3 months by this point, and he was a veteran now. He had learned how to recognize the sound of incoming artillery and dive for cover before the shells hit. He had learned how to spot German positions before they spotted him. He had learned how to survive. He had also learned what he was capable of. During a firefight near the Belgian town of Stavelot in September, Francis's squad was pinned down by a German machine gun position, and the squad leader was wounded. Francis grabbed a Browning automatic rifle from a wounded soldier and crawled forward alone through a drainage ditch until he was close enough to the German position to open fire. He killed the machine gun crew and allowed his squad to advance. His platoon sergeant put him in for a Bronze Star for that action. Francis did not think he had done anything special. He had just done what needed to be done, but his fellow soldiers started looking at him differently after that. The quiet kid from upstate New York was tougher than he looked. The 30th Division spent October and November fighting along the German border in brutal attritional warfare. They captured the city of Aachen after weeks of house fighting. They held defensive positions in the cold autumn rain and waited for orders to attack into Germany itself. The men were exhausted. The division had been in continuous combat since July, and casualties had been heavy. Replacements arrived to fill the gaps in the ranks, but the new men were untrained and scared, and many of them died in their first week of combat. Francis was one of the survivors. He had fought in dozens of engagements and had been lucky enough not to get hit. He had seen friends killed and wounded. He had written letters home to parents explaining how their sons had died. He had become harder and quieter and more focused. He did his job and kept his head down and tried not to think about how much longer his luck would hold. In December, the 30th Division was pulled out of the line and sent to a rest area in Belgium near the town of Normandy. The men were told they would have a few weeks to rest and refit and receive replacements before returning to combat. They set up camp in the snow and tried to relax. They wrote letters home and played cards and slept in real beds for the first time in months. Francis spent his 19th birthday on December 20, first in that rest area. Some of the guys in his squad tried to throw him a little party with some liquor they had scrounged and a cake one of the cooks had made. Francis thanked them and smiled and said he appreciated it, but he felt strange celebrating a birthday in the middle of a war. He thought about home and wondered if his family was thinking about him. He wrote a letter to his mother and told her he was fine and she should not worry. He did not tell her that he had been in combat for 5 months and had seen things that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He did not tell her that he woke up every morning wondering if this would be the day he died. He just told her he loved her and he would see her when the war was over. That same night, the Germans launched the largest offensive they had mounted since D-Day. 3 entire German armies smashed through the American lines in the Ardennes forest in a desperate gamble to split the Allied forces and capture the port of Antwerp. The German offensive caught the Americans completely by surprise. Entire units were overrun. Thousands of American soldiers were killed or captured in the first 48 hours. The 30th Division's rest period ended immediately. They were ordered to move north to help stop the German breakthrough. Francis Currey and his battalion loaded onto trucks in the middle of the night and rode through the snow toward the sound of artillery fire. The Battle of the Bulge had begun, and Francis Currey was about to fight the most important battle of his life. The German offensive exploded across the Ardennes on December 16, 1944, with a fury that stunned the American forces defending the sector. 3 German armies totaling more than 400,000 men and over 1,000 tanks smashed into a thinly held section of the American line that was manned by inexperienced divisions and exhausted units recovering from earlier battles. The Germans attacked in a heavy fog that grounded Allied aircraft and allowed the German armor to move without being spotted from the air. Within hours, the German spearheads had penetrated miles behind American lines. Communication broke down, units were cut off, American commanders struggled to understand what was happening and where the main German thrust was aimed. Panic spread through some units and entire battalions retreated in disorder. The Germans captured thousands of American prisoners and huge stockpiles of fuel and ammunition. For a brief, terrifying moment, it looked like the entire Allied position in Belgium might collapse. The 30th Infantry Division arrived in the battle zone on December 18th and was immediately thrown into the fight to stop the northern shoulder of the German advance. Francis Currey's battalion was ordered to establish a defensive line near the town of Normandy and hold it against any German attack. The situation was chaotic. No one knew exactly where the Germans were or how many of them were coming. The weather was terrible with heavy snow and freezing temperatures. The roads were clogged with American supply trucks and retreating units trying to get away from the German advance. Francis and his squad dug foxholes in the frozen ground and waited. They could hear the sound of artillery fire getting closer. They could see the orange glow of fires burning in villages that the Germans had captured. They knew the enemy was coming, but they did not know when or where the attack would hit. The German attack on the 30th Division's sector began on December 20th. German tanks and infantry probed the American positions looking for weak spots. American artillery fired back, and the sky lit up with shell bursts. Francis spent the day crouched in his foxhole, listening to the battle develop. His battalion commander moved units around trying to plug gaps in the line. American tanks arrived to reinforce the position, but there were not enough of them. German artillery started hitting the American positions with increasing intensity. Shells exploded in the trees and sent deadly splinters of wood and metal flying through the air. Men screamed when they were hit. Medics crawled forward through the snow to drag wounded soldiers back to aid stations. Francis helped carry a wounded man back from the forward line, and the man died in his arms before they reached the medic. Francis went back to his foxhole and tried to stop shaking. He told himself he had seen men die before, and this was no different, but he knew the battle was only beginning and it was going to get much worse. On the night of December 20th, the battalion commander called his company commanders together and told them the situation was desperate. German armor was massing for a major attack that would hit at dawn. The American position was spread too thin, and there were not enough anti-tank weapons to stop a concentrated German assault. The commander said they would have to hold the line no matter what happened, because if the Germans broke through here, they would have a clear road to the Meuse River, and that could decide the entire battle of the Bulge. Every man would have to do his part. Every soldier would have to fight like his life depended on it, because it did. The company commanders went back to their units and passed the word to the platoon leaders and squad leaders. Francis Currey's squad leader gathered them together in the dark and told them what was coming. He said they were going to be hit hard in the morning, and some of them were probably going to die, but they had to hold the line. He looked each man in the eye and asked if they understood. They all nodded. Francis felt his stomach tighten with fear, but he did not say anything. He went back to his foxhole and checked his rifle and his ammunition. He tried to sleep, but he could not. He lay in the frozen darkness listening to the distant rumble of German tanks moving into position. He thought about his family back home. He thought about the mathematics classroom where he had dreamed of teaching someday. He wondered if he would live to see the morning. The German attack began at first light on December 20. first with a massive artillery barrage that turned the frozen forest into an inferno. Hundreds of German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously, and shells rained down on the American positions. The ground shook with the impacts. Trees exploded and showered the foxholes with splinters. The noise was so loud that Francis could not hear himself think. He pressed himself into the bottom of his foxhole and covered his head with his arms and prayed that a shell would not land directly on him. The barrage lasted 30 minutes and it felt like 30 hours. When it finally stopped, Francis lifted his head and looked around. The forest was transformed into a nightmare landscape of shattered trees and smoking craters. Wounded men were screaming for medics. Dead men lay sprawled in and around their foxholes. Francis could taste blood in his mouth from biting his lip. He grabbed his rifle and peered over the edge of his foxhole toward the valley below. The German tanks came through the morning mist like prehistoric monsters. Francis counted 5 Panther tanks spreading out in a line and advancing up the slope toward the American positions. Behind the tanks came waves of German infantry dressed in white winter camouflage, moving in organized assault formations. There were hundreds of them. German machine guns opened fire and tracers streaked through the grey morning light. The Americans started firing back. Riflemen shot at the German infantry. Machine gunners raked the advancing soldiers. The few American anti-tank guns that had survived the artillery barrage opened fire on the German tanks. Francis saw one Panther take a direct hit and stop with smoke pouring from its engine compartment. But the other 4 tanks kept coming, and they were firing their main guns at the American positions. The 75mm shells exploded among the foxholes and threw men into the air like ragdolls. The American line started to buckle under the German pressure. On Francis's right flank, an entire platoon position was overrun by German infantry. The Americans fought hand-to-hand with bayonets and entrenching tools, but there were too many Germans and the position collapsed. The surviving Americans pulled back toward the secondary defensive line. On the left flank, one of the German tanks broke through the anti-tank screen and rumbled into the American rear area, crushing foxholes under its tracks and machine, gunning anyone who tried to run. American soldiers scattered in panic. Officers tried to rally their men, but the situation was deteriorating too fast. Francis saw his battalion commander running forward, waving his pistol and shouting orders. A German tank shell exploded near the commander, and when the smoke cleared, the commander was lying on the ground, not moving. The battalion executive officer tried to take command, but he was hit by machine gun fire a few minutes later. The chain of command was breaking down. No one knew who was in charge anymore. Francis Currey crouched in his foxhole and watched the disaster unfold around him. He could see that the entire American position was about to collapse. The German tanks were getting closer. The German infantry was flanking the American line on both sides. Men were dying or retreating, and no one was stopping the German advance. Francis looked around for his squad leader, but the squad leader was dead. He looked for his platoon sergeant, but the platoon sergeant was wounded and being carried to the rear. He looked at the other men in the nearby foxholes, and he saw fear and confusion on their faces. They were waiting for someone to tell them what to do. They were waiting for someone to take charge and stop the Germans. Francis realized in that moment that no one was coming to save them. No reinforcements were arriving. No air support was available because of the weather. No miracle was going to happen. If someone was going to stop those German tanks, it was going to have to be someone right here, right now. And the only person Francis could see who might be able to do something was himself. He thought about it for maybe 10 seconds. He thought about staying in his foxhole and hoping the Germans would miss him. He thought about retreating with the others and living to fight another day. He thought about all the reasons why what he was thinking about doing was completely insane and would probably get him killed. Then he thought about the 300 American soldiers behind him who would die if the German tanks broke through. He thought about his duty as a soldier. He thought about the oath he had taken when he enlisted. He thought about all the training he had received and all the combat he had survived and what it had all been for. And he decided that this was the moment. This was why he was here. This was what he was supposed to do. So Francis Currey climbed out of his foxhole and started gathering weapons. Francis Currey grabbed a bazooka from a wounded soldier who was being carried past his position. The soldier was unconscious and did not need the weapon anymore. Francis checked the bazooka and found it was loaded with one anti-tank rocket. He slung his rifle over his shoulder and picked up a bag with 3 more bazooka rockets from a supply dump that had been abandoned when the position was overrun. He looked around for someone to be his loader because a bazooka required 2 men to operate effectively, but everyone nearby was either dead or wounded or pinned down by machine gun fire. Francis decided he would have to operate the bazooka alone, which meant he would have to fire 1 shot and then stop to reload by himself, which would take precious seconds during which he would be completely vulnerable. It was not ideal, but nothing about this situation was ideal. He took a deep breath and started walking toward the German tanks. The closest German Panther was about 300 yards away, advancing slowly up the hill with its turret rotating back and forth searching for targets. German infantry soldiers were using the tank as cover and advancing behind it. Francis walked out into the open carrying the bazooka on his shoulder. Bullets were snapping through the air all around him. Machine gun fire was kicking up dirt at his feet. He ignored it. He focused on the tank. He got to within 200 yards and knelt down and aimed the bazooka. He knew he would only get 1 shot before the Germans saw him and concentrated all their fire on him. He steadied his breathing the way he had been taught in training. He aimed for the tank's side armor, which was thinner than the front armor. He squeezed the trigger. The bazooka fired with a loud whoosh, and the rocket streaked across the distance and hit the Panther right below the turret. The explosion was enormous. The tank stopped moving. Smoke poured from the hatch. German crew members bailed out of the burning tank and ran for cover. The German infantry that had been following that tank scattered in confusion. Francis dropped the empty bazooka and picked up his rifle. German soldiers were shooting at him now. He could see muzzle flashes from their rifles. He could hear the crack of bullets passing close to his head. He dropped to the ground and rolled into a shallow depression that gave him some cover. He aimed his M1 Gar and at the nearest group of German soldiers and started firing. He fired 8 shots as fast as he could pull the trigger. The rifle's clip ejected with a distinctive ping sound. He reloaded and fired 8 more shots. He saw German soldiers fall. He saw others dive for cover. He kept firing. He was not thinking anymore. He was operating on pure instinct and training. Shoot, reload. Shoot, reload. Keep shooting until the enemy stops moving, or you run out of ammunition or you die. Those were the only options. The second German Panther turned its turret toward Francis and fired its main gun. The shell exploded 20 feet away, and the blast wave picked Francis up and threw him 10 feet through the air. He landed hard on his back and could not breathe for several seconds. His ears were ringing so loud he could not hear anything else. His vision was blurred. He thought he might have been hit, but he checked himself and found no blood. He rolled over and crawled toward another abandoned bazooka he had seen lying near a destroyed foxhole. He reached the bazooka and checked it. It was loaded. He looked for the second Panther and saw it was turning to face him. The tank commander had seen where the first bazooka shot had come from and was bringing his tank around to kill whoever had fired it. Francis knew he had maybe 5 seconds before that tank fired again, and this time the shell would not miss. He raised the bazooka to his shoulder and fired without really aiming. The rocket flew across the distance and hit the Panther's front armor at an angle and penetrated. The tank exploded from the inside, flames shot out of every hatch, the turret blew off and landed 20 feet away. Francis did not wait to watch. He dropped the bazooka and started running toward a small factory building that was about 50 yards away. German machine gun fire chased him across the open ground. He ran in a zigzag pattern like he had been taught. He made it to the building and dove through a broken window and landed inside on a pile of rubble. Francis lay on the floor of the ruined building gasping for air. His whole body was shaking. He could not believe he was still alive. He had just destroyed 2 German tanks by himself in the open with the entire German army shooting at him, and somehow he had survived. He wanted to stay in the building and hide and wait for the battle to be over, but he looked out through the broken window and saw that 3 more German tanks were still advancing toward the American position. The Germans had been shocked by the sudden destruction of their lead tanks, but they were recovering now and pressing the attack. If those 3 remaining tanks broke through the American line, the battle was over. Francis realized he was not done yet. He had to go back out there. He had to stop those other tanks. He looked around the factory building for more weapons. Inside the ruined factory building, Francis Currey found a stockpile of American weapons and ammunition that had been stored there by a support unit before the German attack. There were boxes of rifle ammunition and hand grenades, and 2 more bazookas with rockets. There was also a Browning automatic rifle with several magazines. Francis loaded his pockets with grenades. He slung the BR over his shoulder. He picked up another bazooka and loaded it. Then he went back to the window and looked out at the battlefield. The 3 remaining German Panthers were spread out now and advancing from different directions. German infantry was moving forward again using the cover of trees and shell craters. The American defensive line was barely holding. Francis could see American soldiers in their foxholes firing desperately at the advancing Germans, but the German fire was overwhelming them. He had to do something quickly, or the position would collapse in the next few minutes. Francis climbed out of the factory building and ran toward the nearest German tank. This Panther was about 150 yards away, moving slowly through the trees with its machine guns firing constantly. Francis ran from cover to cover using destroyed vehicles and fallen trees to shield himself from enemy fire. He got to within 75 yards of the tank and set up the bazooka. A German soldier spotted him and started shooting. Francis felt a bullet tug at his jacket sleeve, but it did not hit him. He aimed the bazooka at the tank's side and fired. The rocket hit the Panther's fuel tank and the entire tank erupted in flames. The explosion was so violent that pieces of the tank flew through the air and landed dozens of yards away. Francis did not wait to see if anyone survived. He dropped the bazooka and unslung the BR and opened fire on the German infantry that had been following the tank. The BR fired 20 rounds as fast as he could pull the trigger. German soldiers dove for cover or fell wounded. Francis changed magazines and kept firing. He was in the open and completely exposed, but he was firing so fast and moving so unpredictably that the Germans could not get a clear shot at him. The 4th German tank saw what was happening and turned to engage Francis. The tank was about 200 yards away, and it fired its main gun at the spot where Francis had been standing. The shell exploded and destroyed a tree, but Francis had already moved. He was running parallel to the tank, staying in its blind spot, where the turret could not rotate fast enough to track him. He ran until he was behind the tank, and then he pulled out a hand grenade. He ran directly at the tank from behind, while the German tank commander was still trying to figure out where Francis had gone. Francis got close enough to throw the grenade onto the tank's engine deck, where the armor was thinnest. The grenade exploded and damaged the engine. The tank stopped moving. Smoke poured from the engine compartment. The German crew opened the hatches to escape, and Francis shot them with the BAR as they climbed out. It was brutal and efficient and necessary. He could not afford to let enemy soldiers live when they would just regroup and attack again. The 5th and final German Panther was the farthest away from Francis's position. It was supporting a German infantry attack on the left side of the American line, and it was firing explosive shells into the American foxholes. Francis could see that this tank was causing massive casualties, and if he did not stop it, the entire left flank would collapse. He looked around for another bazooka, but the only one left was back in the factory building. He would have to cross 200 yards of open ground under fire to get back to the building, and then cross another 200 yards to get into position to shoot at the tank. It was suicide, but Francis had already done half a dozen things that should have killed him, and he was still alive. He decided his luck had to hold for a few more minutes. He started running back toward the factory building. German soldiers saw him running and opened fire. Bullets kicked up snow and dirt all around his feet. A machine gun tracked him across the open ground, stitching a line of impacts that followed him like a deadly zipper. Francis jinked left and right, running in a random pattern that made him harder to hit. He dove behind a wrecked jeep and bullets clanged off the metal. He waited for the machine gun to pause to reload, and then he jumped up and kept running. He made it to the factory building and crashed through the door. He grabbed the last bazooka and loaded it with the last rocket. Then he climbed out a back window and circled around through the trees to get a clear shot at the 5th tank. He could hear the battle raging all around him. He could hear American soldiers shouting and German soldiers yelling and tanks firing and men dying. He focused on his mission: get into position, take the shot, stop the tank. That was all that mattered. Francis came out of the trees about 100 yards from the 5th Panther. The tank was side onto him and stationary while it fired at the American positions. It was a perfect target. Francis knelt behind a fallen tree trunk and aimed the bazooka carefully. He knew this was his last rocket. If he missed, there would be no second chance. He controlled his breathing. He ignored the machine gun fire that was clipping branches off the trees around him. He aimed for the center mass of the tank's side armor. He squeezed the trigger. The bazooka fired, and the rocket flew straight and true, and hit the Panther exactly where Francis had aimed. The tank exploded in a massive fireball that sent the turret spinning through the air. The German infantry that had been advancing behind the tank broke and ran when they saw their last tank destroyed. The German attack collapsed. Francis Currey sat down in the snow behind the fallen tree trunk and stared at the burning wreckage of the 5th German tank. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold his rifle. His ears were ringing from all the explosions. His throat was raw from breathing smoke and cordite fumes. His legs felt like rubber. He realized he had been fighting alone in the open for more than 30 minutes. He realized he had destroyed 5 German tanks by himself. He realized he had killed or wounded dozens of German soldiers. He realized he was still alive when by all rights he should have been dead 10 times over. He did not feel like a hero. He felt like he was going to throw up. He put his head down between his knees and took deep breaths and tried to stop shaking. American soldiers started appearing around him. They came out of their foxholes and out of the tree line, and they gathered around Francis, staring at him like he was some kind of ghost. They had watched him walk out into the open and attack 5 German tanks alone. They had watched him destroy every single tank. They had watched him survive fire that should have killed him a dozen times. They could not believe what they had just witnessed. One sergeant came up to Francis and grabbed him by the shoulders and asked if he was hit. Francis shook his head. The sergeant asked him what the hell he thought he was doing out there. Francis said he was trying to stop the tanks. The sergeant laughed and said he had damn sure stopped them and saved the entire battalion. Other soldiers crowded around, patting Francis on the back and shaking his hand. Francis did not know what to say. He just nodded and said he was glad everyone was okay. The German attack was over. The destruction of all 5 tanks and the heavy casualties among the German infantry had broken the momentum of the assault. The Germans pulled back to regroup and the American line held. Reinforcements arrived later that afternoon and the battalion was able to establish a stronger defensive position. The immediate crisis had passed. The 30th Infantry Division had stopped the northern shoulder of the German advance, and the Battle of the Bulge would turn into an Allied victory over the next few weeks. But on that frozen December morning near Normandy, the outcome had hung in the balance, and 119-year old soldier from upstate New York had made the difference between victory and disaster. Francis, Currey's company commander, found him that evening and told him he was putting him in for the Medal of Honor. Francis said that was not necessary and he had just done his job. The commander said that what Francis had done went far beyond just doing his job. The commander said he had witnessed acts of courage before, but he had never seen anything like what Francis had done that morning. The commander said Francis had single-handedly stopped an armored assault by a numerically superior enemy force, and had saved 300 American lives. The commander said if that did not deserve the Medal of Honor, then nothing did. Francis did not argue. He was too tired to argue. He just nodded and said thank you, sir, and went to find some food and a place to sleep. The other soldiers in the battalion treated Francis differently after that day. They looked at him with awe and respect. They told stories about what he had done, and the stories grew in the telling until Francis became almost a legend. Men who had not been there claimed they had seen him destroy the tanks. Men who had been there described it in dramatic terms like something out of a movie. Francis tried to downplay what he had done, but it was impossible. What he had done was too extraordinary to downplay. He had walked into the face of death and somehow walked back out alive. He had done the impossible when the impossible was the only option. The men knew that kind of courage was rare, and they wanted to be near it because maybe some of it would rub off on them. Francis Currey stayed with the 30th Infantry Division for the rest of the war. He fought in several more battles as the Allies pushed into Germany in early 1945. He was at the Rhine River crossing in March. He was in the final push through central Germany in April. He was there when his division liberated concentration camps and saw the horrors that the Nazis had inflicted on innocent people. Those images would stay with Francis for the rest of his life. He had seen terrible things in combat, but nothing compared to the systematic evil of the concentration camps. It made him understand in a profound way what the war had really been about, and why it had been necessary to fight even when the cost was so high. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, when Germany surrendered unconditionally. Francis Currey was in Germany when he heard the news. His unit celebrated, but Francis felt oddly detached from the joy around him. He was glad the war was over. He was glad he had survived, but he felt like a different person than the boy who had enlisted 2 years earlier. He had seen too much death. He had killed too many enemy soldiers. He had lived with fear and exhaustion for so long that he did not know how to feel normal emotions anymore. He wondered if he would ever be able to go back to the quiet life he had left behind in New York. He wondered if he would ever be able to teach mathematics to children in a peaceful classroom after everything he had experienced. In June of 1945, Francis received orders to return to the United States. The army was demobilizing millions of soldiers as quickly as possible now that the war was over. Francis boarded a transport ship in France and sailed back across the Atlantic. The journey took 2 weeks, just like the journey over had taken 2 years earlier, but this time the ship was filled with men going home instead of men going to war. They talked about what they would do when they got home. They talked about seeing their families and eating their mothers cooking and sleeping in their own beds. They talked about getting jobs and going to college and getting married and starting families. They were ready to put the war behind them and start their lives over. Francis arrived in New York Harbor in July and saw the Statue of Liberty from the deck of the ship and felt something break loose inside his chest. He was home, he had survived. He was one of the lucky ones. He thought about all the men who had not made it home. He thought about the friends he had lost. He thought about the German soldiers he had killed who had been somebody's son or brother or husband just like he was. He thought about the randomness of death in combat and how it could have been him instead of them. He felt grateful and guilty at the same time. He did not know how to process all those emotions, so he just stood at the rail and watched the New York skyline get closer and tried not to cry. The army sent Francis to Fort Dix, New Jersey to process out of the service. He turned in his equipment and his uniforms. He filled out paperwork. He received his discharge papers and his final pay. He was a civilian again. He put on the civilian clothes his family had sent him, and they felt strange after wearing a uniform for 2 years. He bought a bus ticket and rode back up to Sullivan County, New York. His family met him at the bus station in Liberty. His mother hugged him and cried. His father shook his hand and could not stop smiling. His sisters hung on his arms and peppered him with questions. They drove back to Loch Sheldrake and had a welcome home dinner, and Francis tried to act normal and happy. But he felt like he was watching the scene from outside his own body. He felt like he did not quite belong here anymore. He had been changed by the war in ways that people who had not been there could never understand. In December of 1945, 6 months after Francis Currey returned home, he received a telegram from the War Department informing him that he had been awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions on December 21st, 1944, near Normandy, Belgium. The telegram said he was invited to the White House in Washington, D.C., for a ceremony where President Harry Truman would personally present him with the medal. Francis read the telegram and felt overwhelmed. He knew the Medal of Honor was the highest military decoration the country could award. He knew it was reserved for acts of extraordinary courage above and beyond the call of duty. He knew that many recipients received the medal posthumously because they had died in the action that earned them the award. He felt honored and humbled and unworthy all at the same time. He thought about all the other soldiers who had fought just as bravely as he had, but had not been recognized. He thought about the men who had died on that December morning while he had survived. He felt like he was accepting the medal on behalf of all of them. The ceremony took place at the White House on January 4th, 1946. Francis traveled to Washington with his parents and his sisters. They stayed in a hotel and toured the city, and Francis felt like a tourist in his own country. Everything seemed so peaceful and normal compared to the war. People walked down the street without fear, children played in parks, stores were full of goods, no one was shooting at anyone. It was strange and wonderful, and Francis tried to enjoy it, but part of him still felt like he was waiting for artillery shells to start falling. On the day of the ceremony, Francis put on his army dress uniform that he had kept after his discharge. His mother helped him with the tie. His father told him how proud he was. They went to the White House and were escorted into a reception room with about a dozen other Medal of Honor recipients who were being honored that day. President Truman entered the room and shook hands with each recipient. When he got to Francis, he looked at the citation that described what Francis had done, and he looked back at Francis and said that what Francis had accomplished was one of the most remarkable individual acts of heroism he had ever read about. The president said the country owed Francis a debt that could never be repaid. Francis said he had just done his duty, sir. The president smiled and said he wished every soldier had Francis's sense of duty. Then the president led them into a larger room where a crowd of officials and reporters and photographers had gathered. The president called each recipient forward one at a time and read their citations and placed the Medal of Honor around their necks and shook their hands. When it was Francis's turn, the president read the citation describing how 19-year-old Sergeant Francis Currey had single-handedly destroyed 5 enemy tanks and killed or wounded dozens of enemy soldiers while under heavy fire, and how his actions had saved his battalion from being overrun. The president placed the medal around Francis's neck, and the crowd applauded, and cameras flashed, and Francis stood there feeling like the moment was not quite real. After the ceremony, reporters crowded around Francis asking him questions. They wanted to know what he had been thinking when he walked out into the open to attack those tanks. They wanted to know if he had been scared. They wanted to know what it felt like to be a hero. Francis did not know how to answer those questions. He said he had not been thinking about anything except stopping the tanks. He said of course he had been scared, but fear did not matter when your friends needed you. He said he did not feel like a hero because he had just done what needed to be done. The reporters were not satisfied with those answers. They wanted dramatic quotes and emotional stories, but Francis did not give them what they wanted. He was polite but quiet, and after a few minutes the reporters moved on to other recipients who were more willing to talk. Francis was relieved. He did not want to be famous. He just wanted to go home. Francis and his family returned to New York after the ceremony. The local newspapers ran stories about the hometown boy who had won the Medal of Honor. There was a small reception at the town hall where the mayor gave a speech, and people congratulated Francis and shook his hand. Francis smiled and thanked everyone, but he felt uncomfortable with all the attention. He did not want to be treated differently than anyone else. He had served his country like millions of other men had served. He had been lucky enough to survive when many had not. He had been given a medal for doing something extraordinary, but he did not think that made him special. He thought it just meant he had been in the right place at the right time to make a difference. After a few weeks, the attention died down and life in Loch Sheldrake returned to normal. Francis was grateful. He wanted normalcy. He wanted to forget about the war and move on with his life. In the fall of 1946, Francis Currey enrolled at Champlain College in Plattsburgh, New York, to study education. He had decided before the war that he wanted to be a teacher, and the war had not changed that ambition. If anything, the war had reinforced it. Francis had seen what hate and violence could do to the world. He had seen how easily young men could be convinced to kill each other for causes they barely understood. He thought that education was the antidote to that ignorance. He thought that if he could teach young people to think critically and question authority and see other human beings as individuals rather than enemies, then maybe he could help prevent future wars in some small way. It was idealistic thinking, but Francis was young enough to still believe that one person could make a difference. College was difficult for Francis at first. He was older than most of the other students because he had spent 2 years in the army. He had seen and done things that the other students could not imagine. He sometimes had trouble concentrating in class because his mind would wander back to Belgium or Germany. He had nightmares about the war. He would wake up in his dorm room sweating and disoriented, thinking he was back in a foxhole under artillery fire. It took him months to adjust to civilian life and academic routine, but he was determined to succeed. He studied hard. He made friends with other veterans who were attending college on the G. Bill, he focused on his coursework in mathematics and education. He joined the Campus Veterans Organization. He went to football games and school dances and tried to act like a normal college student, even though he did not always feel normal. Francis graduated from Champlain College in 1949 with a degree in education. He was certified to teach mathematics and science at the secondary school level. He started looking for teaching jobs in upstate New York. He applied to several school districts and was offered a position at a high school in Schenectady, New York, teaching mathematics. He accepted the job and moved to Schenectady in the fall of 1949. He rented a small apartment near the school. He prepared his lesson plans and organized his classroom. On the first day of school, he stood in front of a room full of teenagers and introduced himself as Mr. Currey, their mathematics teacher. He did not mention that he was a Medal of Honor recipient. He did not mention that he had fought in World War II. He did not mention that he had destroyed 5 German tanks by himself and saved 300 American lives. He was just Mr. Currey, the math teacher, and that was exactly how he wanted it. Francis taught mathematics for the next several years at schools in New York and later in Vermont. He was a good teacher. He was patient with students who struggled. He made mathematics accessible and interesting by using real-world examples. He encouraged students to ask questions and think for themselves. He treated every student with respect regardless of their ability or background. Students liked him because he did not talk down to them, and he genuinely seemed to care about their success. Parents liked him because their children were learning and enjoying school. Administrators liked him because he was professional and reliable and never caused problems. Francis found satisfaction in teaching. He liked seeing students understand concepts that had confused them. He liked helping young people prepare for their futures. He felt like he was doing something worthwhile with his life. In 1950, Francis married a woman named Joanne, whom he had met through friends in Schenectady. They had a quiet wedding with family and close friends. They bought a small house in a peaceful neighborhood. They started a family. Francis became a father, and he devoted himself to his children with the same quiet dedication he brought to everything else. He coached their little league teams. He helped them with their homework. He taught them to be kind and honest and to stand up for what was right. He never talked about the war with his children. They knew their father had been a soldier, but they did not know about the Medal of Honor or what he had done in Belgium. Francis had put the medal away in a drawer and rarely looked at it. That part of his life was over, and he wanted to keep it separate from his life as a teacher and a father and a husband. For decades, Francis Currey lived a quiet, ordinary life. He taught school, he raised his family, he mowed his lawn on weekends and paid his taxes and voted in elections and went to church on Sunday. His neighbors knew him as a friendly retired teacher who lived down the street. His students remembered him as a good teacher who had helped them pass algebra. His children knew him as a devoted father who had always been there for them. Very few people knew that Francis Currey was a Medal of Honor recipient. He did not talk about it. He did not wear his medal. He did not attend military reunions or veterans events. He had moved on from the war, and he did not want to live in the past. But the war had not moved on from Francis. He still had nightmares occasionally. He would wake up in the middle of the night, thinking he heard artillery fire or German tanks. He would sometimes freeze in the grocery store when he heard a loud noise that reminded him of gunfire. He avoided violent movies because they triggered memories he did not want to revisit. He never talked about these things with anyone, not even his wife. He thought that talking about the war would make him seem weak or damaged. He thought that real men dealt with their problems privately without complaining. So he kept his memories and his pain locked inside and only let them out in the dark hours before dawn when no one could see. As Francis got older, he started to think more about the war. He thought about the men he had served with. He wondered what had happened to them. He wondered if they were still alive. He wondered if they ever thought about that December morning in Belgium when they had all nearly died. He thought about the German soldiers he had killed. He wondered if those men had families who still mourned them. He wondered if the German tank crews had known they were about to die when his bazooka rockets hit their tanks. He felt a strange kinship with those enemy soldiers now that so many years had passed. They had all been young men following orders and doing what they thought was right. The war had been over for decades, but the ghosts remained. In the 1980s and 1990s, there was a renewed public interest in World War II veterans and their stories. Books and documentaries and movies brought the war back into popular consciousness. Young people who had not been born until decades after the war wanted to hear from the men who had fought in it. Veterans organizations encouraged Medal of Honor recipients to share their stories with schools and civic groups. Francis resisted at first, but eventually he agreed to speak at a few events. He would go to schools and talk to students about the war. He would describe what combat was like. He would explain why the war had been necessary. He would urge young people to appreciate the freedoms they enjoyed because so many had died to secure those freedoms. He always downplayed his own actions. He would say he had just been a soldier doing his job. But when students asked him directly about the Medal of Honor, he would tell them the story of that December morning in Belgium. He would describe the German tanks and the desperate situation and the decision he had made to do something rather than nothing. The students would sit in stunned silence, listening to this elderly man describe acts of incredible courage in a voice that was calm and matter.